Good evening, welcome. It's good to see you all. We are so pleased to have our opening musical performance today, Pick a Rib 3 Clarinet Trio. Local clarinetist Tony Bailiff and drummer David Michael from Southside Aces, along with pianist Rick Carlson, have been exploring the music of the clarinet trio for the past 7 years. You'll be submerged in 1920s Decatur Street in New Orleans, 1930s penthouse parties in New York, and 1940s Los Angeles jazz clubs. Please welcome Pick a Rib 3.
Thank you. Thank you. That was Pick a Rib, Part 1, a Benny Goodman song. And we are Pick a Rib 3, as previously mentioned. So we're just going to go right ahead and just keep playing some music. That Benny Goodman song, Part 1 of Pick a Rib. It's okay to just investigate Part 1 on your own, but just don't worry about Part 2. It's not as good. We're going to play one now by Gus Kahn called I'll Never Be the Same. Thank you very much. That was I'll Never Be the Same. We have been spending all these years exploring the music of mostly the 1920s and 30s and a little bit into the 40s, and all these incredible clarinetists. Benny Goodman led perhaps the most famous trio with Gene Krupa on the drums and Teddy Wilson on the piano, but all those clarinetists of that time at some point or another played a clarinet in that kind of a pared down trio. It's really fantastic music to explore. And then the other thing we do is we're composers in this band. And so right now I'd like to bring us all the way up into this century, and a composer by our piano player, Rick Carlson. He wrote this inspired by one of our mentors, Henry Blackburn. Henry Blackburn is a local man who just celebrated his 99th and a half birthday. You celebrate half birthdays at that point, and he played with us on his birthday. Anyway, he was born and raised in Florida by a preacher, and so Rick wrote this song called "Preacher's Kid." Thank you. That was Rick Carlson's Preacher's Kid. And now we're gonna play a song that has been famous in the jazz repertoire for almost 100 years now. Written in 1930 by Johnny Green. It's called Body and Soul. Benny Goodman had an incredible version of it, and so here it is. All right, that was Body and Soul. All right, we're gonna play another one. This one is exactly like you. It was a song, I think, that the Benny Goodman Trio recorded back in maybe 1935 or 36, 35. And, well, here we go. We're gonna feature Dave Michael, our drummer, on this one. Okay. That was exactly like you. Well, we're going to finish up. We have this one last song. As mentioned before, we are the Pick-a-Rib 3, and that is Dave Michael on the drums, Rick Carlson on piano, I'm Tony Bailiff on the clarinet. We're going to finish with a famous George Gershwin song that Benny Goodman put through the ringer. It's called Oh, Lady Be Good.
Good evening. Let's thank Pick a Rib 3. I know we only have one of the ribs left, but... Good evening. Hello, I am Megan Gage-Finn. I serve Westminster as the Senior Associate Pastor, and it is good to be here together this evening for tonight's forum. Welcome again to Westminster, where this has been the home for the Westminster Town Hall Forum since 1980. I hope that you'll take time after this evening's program to enjoy our spaces, tour the art gallery, stop at the library, and of course, let's join together for the Breads and Spreads reception in Westminster Hall. At this time, I'd like to introduce to you the newly appointed interim director of the Town Hall Forum, Erica Carter, who just began in her new role just last week. Erica, she's off here to your left. We're thrilled to have Erica's interim leadership in this transitional time. She holds a Master's of Public Policy from the Humphrey School of Public Affairs and most recently served as Senior Communications Manager for Global Communications for Ecolab. Thank you. And now I would like to introduce this evening's guest moderator, Luz Maria Frias. Luz Maria most recently served as Deputy Attorney General for the state of Minnesota. She was the first Latina Deputy Attorney General in the office in the office's 170-year history. She previously served as the President and Chief Executive Officer of the YWCA of Minneapolis. She holds a master's and Juris Doctor degrees from the University of Iowa and has received numerous awards over the past 30 years for her work as a civil rights advocate, and has held several leadership roles and is a frequent lecturer on the issues of management, race equity, gender equity, diversity, and inclusion. We thank her for guest moderating this evening as well as our November forum, and please join me in welcoming our guest moderator, Luz Maria Frias.
Thank you, Megan. Well, good evening, everybody. Greetings and welcome to the Westminster Town Hall Forum. Again, my name is Luz Maria Frias, and I will serve as your guest moderator this evening with our distinguished guest, Larry Jacobs. I'd like to take a moment to thank the media sponsors of today's program. MinnPost is a nonpartisan, nonprofit, reader-supported source of Minnesota news. You can visit them online at minnpost.com. And thanks as well to Sahan Journal, celebrating 5 years of nonprofit journalism for and about Minnesota's immigrants and communities of color. You could visit them at sahanjournal.com. I'm nursing a little bit of a dry throat, scratchy throat, so I've got a lozenge I need to finish off here. The Town Hall Forum is also pleased to partner today with Minnesota Public Radio. This is a good moment to remind you all to please silence your phones. And we sincerely appreciate you doing so we can make the event that much more enjoyable for us all. Thank you. In the second half of today's program, Professor Jacobs will be taking questions from the audience. Those of you with us in the sanctuary will find a blank question card in your program. Please use that card to record a question for our speaker, and during the question and answer period, there will be an usher that will come by and collect it from you. And if you are watching online, please write your questions into the chat under the video at any point. We'll also collect and present those as time allows. Following today's presentation, join us for our Breads and Spreads reception in Westminster Hall, which is located to the right as you exit the sanctuary. Now, for more than 40 years, the Westminster Town Hall Forum has invited speakers of conscience to address issues of the day from an ethical perspective. Can we please get a rousing applause for the incredible contributions to our community for the past 40 years? Our final forum takes place on November 14th. McKenna Kelly, political reporter for Wired, will address social media and how influencers are playing a bigger role in our lives and in politics than they did in the 2020 election. She will explain the rise of influencers and dissect the impact they had in this fall's presidential election. This post-election forum on November 14th will be interesting to those who are social media savvy, as well as those who might ask, what's a social influencer? We invite you to visit our website, westminsterforum.org, to see a list of all programs, past and present. And one last note before we begin. This is a critically important fundraising period for the forum. Today's program and everything that the Town Hall Forum does is made possible by supporters like you. Donations from individuals are far and away the largest source of the funding for the forum. In short, the forum doesn't happen without supporters like you. If you can, please support the forum. For those of you here in person, there are donation envelopes in your programs. And if you're watching the live stream or after the live stream, you can go to westminsterforum.org/donate. It's never too late to donate. Thank you in advance for your generosity in helping this forum continue to bring dynamic speakers and content to the forefront. And now, I'm going to give you a little insight tip. We're going to take just a moment as we allow NPR to prepare for the broadcasting. Give me just a quick couple of seconds here. Okay, getting the go-ahead. Let's go. Larry Jacobs is an American political scientist, founder, and director of the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota. He was appointed the Walter F. and Joan Mondale Chair for Political Studies at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs in 2005 and holds the McKnight Presidential Chair as well. He has written or edited alone or collaboratively 17 books and over 100 scholarly articles, in addition to numerous reports and media essays on American democracy, national and Minnesota elections, political communications, healthcare reform, and economic inequality. His new book, Democracy Under Fire: Donald Trump and the Breaking of American History, is steeped in history and invaluable political observations. One quote that stopped me in my tracks is attributed to James Madison from 2 centuries ago. Men of factious tempers or of sinister designs may gain power and then betray the interests of the people. Say it again. Men of factious tempers or of sinister designs may gain power and then betray the interests of the people. Prescient indeed. In this book, Professor Jacobs examines the historic forces within America's party system that he argues have, over time, dangerously weakened democracy, widened political inequality as well as racial disparities, and rewarded toxic political polarization. He offers recommendations to restrain the unbridled ambition of politicians who thrive on division and instead generate broad citizen engagement and tangible policymaking. Please help me in welcoming to the Westminster Town Hall Forum, Professor Larry Jacobs.
Thank you. It's such an honor to be here in this cherished space that I've been to so many times in the spots you are in tonight. I want to just take a moment to thank those who've organized tonight. As someone who puts on a lot of programming, I am a deep admirer of the organizers and the fundraisers. So thank you to all the people involved in the Town Hall Forum. the volunteers, the people who sit on the committees, thank you. Silence. Silence can be arresting sometimes. And for me, it's particularly eye-catching when it highlights the differences between American society and politics and those in other countries. For instance, we see that in other countries, it's fairly common for there to be national service programs, what's referred to as a civilian service. And the purpose of that is to encourage social cohesion, to meet your neighbor and to find the common bounds working together. This is a silence in America. We don't have that as it exists in other countries. Here's another area of silence in our country: the lack of national party control over the selection of political candidates to run for office. Example, United Kingdom held very important elections this summer. Before those elections, the leaders of the two major parties, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, each excluded candidates. Why? Because those candidates were opposed to the leaders of the parties, were opposed to the party platforms that had been put together, and they advocated sharp moves to the left or to the right. And so they were excluded. No uproar. I mean, of course, the right and left complained, but the election went on. Why? Because democracy is defined as a battle between the Conservative and the Labour Party, not the internal mechanisms within the party. Wow, what a difference with America. Because in America, there's a silence when it comes to the leadership of the Democratic and Republican Party. They exercise no control over the selection of the candidates. Tonight, I want to talk about how that happened. Why did our political parties abdicate control of who can run for office? Even if they disagree with the party and the platform and disagree with the organization of our country based on a time-honored constitution. And I want to talk about the dire consequences. Because in my view, the consequences of this fatal decision may well imperil our country. Donald Trump has been nominated 3 times by the Republican Party. He's not been a longtime party member. He is opposed to the core policy objectives of the Republican Party for many decades, including free trade, immigration, such as George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan advocated for some time, entitlement reform, and on down the list. And the leaders of that party, senior leaders of the Republican Party, as well as members of his cabinet, as well as senior military officials who are nonpartisan, have all come out and said, this individual should not be nominated again. And yet, he has been. This has happened because we have turned our backs on a tradition that was established during the period of the Constitution's framing and ratification and early years of operation. James Madison, thank you for that lovely quote, had made the argument that was adopted that in America we ought to marry the voice of the citizen through voting and other means, along with filters to restrain demagogues who would rise to power by claiming they speak for the people. Tonight, I'm going to draw on this on my book, Democracy Under Fire, to pull out some of the main themes. I want to revisit that founding era in which James Madison laid out a model for democratic representation. And then I want to look at 3 critical junctures in which that model was turned down, in which it was broken apart, in which we abandoned the lessons that Madison and others had imparted to us over the years. And I want to tell you right at the outset, because I have started with some harsh words about former President Donald Trump, I am not a partisan. The Democrats are fully culpable in this change, and you will see over the coming 20 or 30 minutes their role. So this is not a partisan screed by any means. Indeed, I have to tell you that my orientation increasingly over time has moved towards a traditional conservative who's devoted to institutions and to founding values. Hamilton. What a great play, right? Isn't that a great play? I mean, I've seen it twice. I've got the CD. I play for my students, some of my favorite songs. Great entertainment, poor history. It was James Madison who was and has been declared the father of the American Constitution. And James Madison was motivated to organize the coming together of leaders around the Confederacy in 1787 in a steaming hot Philadelphia to frame the Constitution. Why did he do this? Because he said he had a dark foreboding about America. He talked specifically about the evils of excess democracy, the defect of the adequate statesmen who engaged their factious tempers and concocted sinister designs. This is what consumed Madison to pull together this really surprising and in some ways clandestine group to draw up an entire new pathway for the direction of America at that time. And there were two real commitments that Madison brought to the fore in the Constitution and would develop afterwards once he was in government and politics. One was to establish the scheme of representation, to incorporate the promise in the Declaration of Independence of 1776 that consent to the governed was essential. He also, though, built institutions that would filter out extremists and demagogues. Those two ideas were at the forefront of Madison's concerns. Now, after 1787, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and then others, including Martin Van Buren, would embrace the political party as a necessary component of this form of representation that would incorporate the voice of the people, but also filter the demagogues and extremists. Those two came together. Now, I have to say right at the outset, and I'm sure we're going to pick this up later in the questions, that what I am describing is by no means a fulsome democracy that Madison had in mind. It excluded women and excluded Americans of color, this is the history of America, in a lot of ways, is overcoming that legacy. Now, I want to talk about three distinct assaults on Madison's system of filters. The first was by Andrew Jackson during his presidency, 1827 to 1837. Jackson had risen to prominence because he was a successful military leader. He had brought to America a phenomenal victory in the battle against the British in the War of 1812 in the city of New Orleans. It gave him great national standing. And then in 1828, he won the election by really one of the most extraordinary episodes of democratic mobilization. He increased the size of the electorate by threefold, which is astounding when you think there really weren't roads, there wasn't a communication system. It was a phenomenal moment, and often this period is known for this kind of democratization that occurred. Well, something else happened. And really, it's the institutional legacy of Jackson, which was the establishing of a national party convention of state delegates. Its purpose was to select the party candidate and to aid the mass mobilization of supportive voters. Now, that idea of introducing a party convention to select the party's candidate would have enduring importance. It initiated a unique pattern in the United States of equating democracy with how we operate our parties internally, right? You remember the Brits, it's conservative against labor. and the selection of candidates internally, not really a big deal. But in America, we have become obsessed with how the internal operations of the party work, and Andrew Jackson bears a big responsibility for that. This was a moment where we see the beginning of this retreat from Madison's reliance on democratic institutions to filter out demagogues and extremists. The second critical assault on Madison's system of filters occurred during a period known as the Progressive Era. This is basically the first 33 decades of the 20th century. This is be distinguished from the progressives of today. This is an historic period, the Progressive Era. Some of the legislation and reforms were liberal, some weren't. But this was a period in which the reformers focused on Andrew Jackson's innovation, which was the state party, and savaged it. They said that what Jackson had created and what it had become over the next near century was an affront to democracy. It had been taken over by the corrupt party machines, Tammany Hall in New York, and other sorts of operations around the country. And the response of the reformers during the Progressive Era was harsh. They threw away Madison's warnings, and instead they attempted to remove the political parties as a gatekeeper. Robert La Follette from Wisconsin was a leader of this, and he had argued vociferously for stripping the power of nomination from the political parties. Teddy Roosevelt was another advocate for the direct primary as a solution to the corruption of the party machine. And underlying this was a rationale that I think is diluted, and I think we need to think much more critically about it. Their argument, the progressive reformers, their argument was that the direct primary would empower the people. They would control the nomination, not the corrupt inside bosses. And the government would then respond to the people, not the corrupt party bosses. Here's something surprising that's unimaginable today. State and local party organizations, leading intellectuals like Robert Crowley, who co-founded the New Republic and wrote the best-selling books of the era, they stopped this. The direct primary had been adopted in more than 20 states, and yet there was this uprising saying, what are you doing? This is going to let in the demagogues and the extremists, just as Madison warned us. And so you see this tremendous debate breaking out around the country that fiercely defended the role of the political party as an organization, fiercely opposed and stopped the spread of the direct primary. The claim that the direct primary would represent the people was derided. Robert Crowley and others referred to it as sentimentalism. That would put an end to the selection of the best people for public office. Now, the reception that direct primary got after that moment is damning. Its spread stopped. It was repealed in a number of states. And something else happened. In the South, the direct primary continued. It continued as a form of power by the white supremacists. Because with the adoption of the 15th Amendment in 1870, African American men had the right to vote. And so the white supremacists needed a way to unite the white vote. And so they kept the direct primary alive. And that's how it really, prospered in this period after the 1920s, really up until the Civil Rights Movement and the Voting Rights Act of 1964. Third retreat from Madison's warnings, and really the coup de grace to political parties, occurred in 1971. The 1968 Democratic Convention was a pitiful riot. It was a police riot. And the pretext of some folks pushing for the end of the Democratic Party organization was to say that it was now time to give power to the people. The promise of the progressive era reformers a century ago from today was now catapulted to the front. And the driver of this was liberal icon George McGovern, who many of you remember was a 1972 Democratic presidential candidate. He was the U.S. Senator from South Dakota for many years. And McGovern had promised that the direct primary would finally strengthen our democracy and would assure that the people, and not the bosses, would rule America. And let's be honest, George McGovern was not an innocent in this. He was very much focused on winning the nomination of the Democratic Party in 1972. The Democratic Party organization, and particularly labor unions, were fiercely opposed to McGovern. He would never have gotten the nomination if the party organization remained intact. And so he joined in what some have described as a private coup to knock off the parties and their role in deciding who would be the nominee. The 1971 recommendations that McGovern had helped to formulate with Fred Harris led to the quick adoption of direct primaries for presidential elections. It increased fourfold from the late 1960s up until our century, and now is hovering about 40 or so, varying. The Republican Party quickly adopted the direct primary because they saw that the Democrats were getting a lot of money, a lot of attention, and they wanted some of the action. The impacts of the spread of the direct primary after the early 1970s has been devastating, absolutely devastating. And I want to talk a bit about some of those effects. And what I want to tell you is the impacts, these devastating impacts, were not surprises. They were almost precisely what Robert Crowley and other party and local organizers and reformers had predicted a century ago. The main impact has been it's opened the door for small, unrepresentative groups of ideological activists to select the nominees. And there's a two-step process here that we see again and again and again. The first step is we see turnout that's very low. Presidential elections, it might be a quarter or a third of each party's base of support that would turn out to vote in the primaries. Midterm elections, far less, 10, 15% that would turn out. So this is not a large number of people. It's a slice. For instance, in the 2016 presidential election, 129 million Americans voted. That's 66% of the electorate, or about maybe 50%. And they were forced to choose among the candidates, including a Republican candidate who had only received about 6% of the primary vote and who had been opposed by all the major leaders of the Republican Party. Now, I've told you this is small. It's also quite unrepresentative. The folks who vote in primary elections tend to be quite ideological, especially in the Republican Party. In Iowa this year, about 90% describe themselves as conservative, and many of those describe themselves as very conservative. So this is not the people, or a very bizarre notion of the people. This is a slice of America. In fact, the Republican direct primaries helps to explain this factious group that now has so much power in the United States House of Representatives, the so-called Freedom Caucus. Many of those members of the Freedom Caucus were elected in direct primaries in which they would win a small fraction of the vote. There would be a large field. They might win 20, 30, maybe 40% of the vote. But they had a loyal faction behind them, and they prevailed. And they now have the House of Representatives, when the Republicans are in the majority, in its grasp. It decides whether there's going to be a vote on paying our debt and preventing America from going into default. And others. Republican colleagues describe the Freedom Caucus, and this is the words of Republican leaders, as insane. Some describe it as a legislative terrorist that wants to burn the whole place down. They are a product of the direct primary as well. Now, step two, the first step is the nomination of candidates who are supported by these ideological factions. Step two is what we're familiar with, which is members of each party vote for their nominee. And this is part of the sorting that's gone on. We're going to see, in 2 weeks' time, that 94 or 95% of Republicans will vote for Donald Trump, and a similar number for Kamala Harris. The idea that we now vote, party members vote, for the candidate based on the qualifications, that is gone. That is just over for most voters. And so we are now in a process in which the power over who's being nominated and then running for office and then getting elected are in the hands of a small ideological faction. And that is the answer to the question, how could Donald Trump be nominated again, even though he is not a long-term Republican, he's rejected the party's platform, he has been convicted, twice impeached, and so on. That is the answer. Now, I promised you I wasn't a partisan. Some of you may be wondering, what's going on here? So let me tell you about the Democrats. George Wallace. George Wallace was a ferocious advocate for white segregation in Alabama. He was governor off and on from the 1960s for about 2 decades. He almost won the 1972 Democratic presidential nomination. There are some scholars who are quite confident he would have won it if it wasn't for an assassin's bullet that put him in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. If you go back, as I have, and you read George Wallace's speeches, what you see is Donald Trump prefigured. You see the use of violent, sometimes racist messages. You see sinister threats. At one point, he warned the Democratic Party, shaking his finger, that they needed to watch out because the average citizens are going to run you over. He's talking about his own party members. And then the kind of angry populism. He appealed to the grievances of financially vulnerable and politically disaffected white voters. So that's George Wallace. He was definitely a product of the direct primary, gave him that access. There were no party leaders who could stop him. If he hadn't been shot, he could well have been the nominee in 1972 of the Democratic Party. Some of you know the name the Squad, the Democratic Progressive Group in the House of Representatives. They too are a product of the direct primary. AOC beat the moderate incumbent up-and-coming leader, Joe Crowley, in a 2018 direct primary. Turnout, 12%. 12%. And to her credit, she had mobilized the progressive base in the 14th Congressional District in New York. Rashida Tlaib, she defeated the centrists with 18% turnout. Cori Bush, Jamal Bowman, similar stories. So the ability of these factions to use the primary to nominate and thereby elect in our partisan environment candidates is not limited to the Republican Party. There is a difference, though, and I want to emphasize this. There's not an equivalency between what's going on in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. Because in the Democratic Party, we have seen again and again that voters and groups have checked the progressives. Bernie Sanders, after all, ran for president twice, didn't come close. We saw just a few months ago that Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman were defeated in the 2024 primaries. And we've seen that the centrists in the Democratic Party have been able to fend off the progressives. And the reason for that difference between the control of the Republican Party by these factions And the more contested situation on the Democratic side is the composition of the parties. It's more diverse in the Democratic Party in terms of ideology, in terms of interests, and in terms of public policy preferences. You don't see Democrats voting for default. You don't see them voting against elections that have been certified. So the first impact of direct primaries and the abandonment of James Madison's system is that unrepresentative and small factions are now in charge of nominations, and therefore are putting candidates on the doorstep of power. And those elections are often driven by things having nothing to do with the candidates themselves, having to do with the conditions of inflation, the economy, and things of that sort at the time. There's a second impact of direct primaries, which is once it becomes clear to those who are in power, the power of the direct primary and the partisan activists, the ideologues in their power, they cave to it. And this helps to explain why 70% of the U.S. House Republicans voted in January 2021 not to accept the results of the 2020 election. And this pattern has continued and will continue if Donald Trump is elected. Now, I want to take a few minutes and suggest reform, because I'm, despite what I've been telling you, an optimist, and I am impressed by the vigor and the resilience of American democracy. There are many different reforms out there and ideas, and I'm sure some of you have some. My focus is on practical, doable reforms that will strengthen the political party organization as a necessary bulwark against extremism and demagogues. I would start with Herbert Crowley and others who argued that it was necessary to reduce the absurd multiplication of elections. There was an idea during the Reform era that elections equaled democracy. Well, now what we have are elections in which few people vote. When you go to the ballot, excuse me, when you go to the ballot on in a few weeks, you're going to see a whole bunch of offices that you may not vote for, and the truth is few of your neighbors will vote for. Those are often the product of the progressive era. Let me give you an example of what this has amounted to. In a 4-year period, my research assistant and I tried to count up how many times people are being asked to vote. And what we found is in a 4-year period, Americans are being asked to vote in about 20 to 40 contests. In Germany, over the same period of time, it's 6 to 8. So, this is exhausting voters. They're losing interest. We need fewer elections that matter more. And so I would suggest we need a kind of democratic auditing, that the 500,000 elections that are now going on in America, many of them with very little turnout, need to be scaled back dramatically. Walter Mondale, who I taught with for many years, when we were talking about this argument, he said, well, I've got an idea. We ought to have fewer really good elections that matter more. We ought to fight it out over the substantive debates between the parties. What the Conservative and Labor Party did this summer, in other words. Not what America has been doing, which is this, kind of circle firing squad. Secondly, I think we ought to look for ways to return to Madison's filters. And for me, one step is to increase the proportion of superdelegates in the Democratic Party and what are known as unpledged delegates in the Republican Party. These folks are the ones who've been elected. They are party leaders. They conduct a kind of peer review of candidates. They are not ideologues. They're looking to how can we win. And if you're looking for how can we win, it pulls you to the center of public opinion rather than to the extremes. So I would look for how do we increase those? It's going to be a fight, Because what I'm describing, some people will say, well, that's a violation of democracy. But remember, the way democracy has been defined in this country is cockeyed. It's being defined in terms of the power of the few. I think the nonpartisan primaries that we're seeing in California, the top two, or Alaska, I think those are really worth looking at. I don't think they're quite working yet, but we've got to be patient with reform. I also think we need to invest in the infrastructure of democracy. I've been working for about 15 years building a program to create a pipeline of new folks going into election administration. And I've been working with these folks. They are some of the great patriots who are facing incredible threats and show up for work every day. And so we've created a program. It's called the Certificate for Election Administration, or CEA. It's nonpartisan. It's the largest in the country. We need to be thinking about those sort of steps. We need an infrastructure of democracy so we're not so vulnerable to the extremists. There are many ideas out and about democracy, and I'm a big believer in the more ideas, the better. What I would say are a few rules. One is it needs to be doable. Getting rid of the Electoral College, I know there's a big debate about that recently. It's a solid idea. Is it going to happen? I don't know. I put more emphasis on how do we get it done? And I would say, in our lifetimes, how do we get it done? How can we move things forward? And secondly, I would say we need things that are going to restrain that small group of elites who are playing such an oversized role in our politics. We need to find a way to diminish and challenge the demagogues and the extremists, or we are going to be in some real trouble maybe too soon.
My magic step stool. Thank you, Professor Jacobs. This is the Westminster Town Hall Forum, coming to you from Westminster Presbyterian Church in downtown Minneapolis. I'm Luz Maria Frias, guest moderator of today's forum. Our speaker today is Professor Larry Jacobs. While the ushers collect questions from the in-house audience, I'd like to thank our broadcast partner, Minnesota Public Radio, as well as our other media partners, MinnPost and Sahan Journal. I'm going to step to the side now. And you can watch or listen back to all of our past programs on our website at westminsterforum.org. Now, if you're ready, Professor Jacobs, I will start with the first question, then follow with questions from the audience. And I happen to have the first question for you. One of the many benefits of being the moderator. Okay, early in your book, you state, and I quote, that reformers who promoted the direct primary reconstituted America's racial orders first by creating white primaries that kept the Jim Crow South in power until the mid-20th century, and later by dissipating the votes of blacks, indigenous, and other people of color. Can you please unpack that further for us?
If you're going to write a serious history about American politics, you have to write a story about the exclusion and the marginalization of blacks and Hispanics, Native Americans, and other peoples of color. And in writing this book, each one of these episodes that I mentioned, I brought forth the implications for these populations. And however bad it's been for the Madisonian agenda, it's been worse for communities of color. The primaries, first they favored the white supremacists in the South, even after America kind of abandoned them. And then as they began to operate after the early 1970s, they frequently, by operation in terms of recruitment and fundraising, hurt candidates of color. So this is something we need to shine a bright light on. I do think Joe Biden's decision to bring forward South Carolina and other states that have large Democratic primary voting populations is an acknowledgement of this shameful history. We need more of it.
Great. Well, as they're still sorting through the questions here, with the advent of superdelegates, don't we run the risk of them becoming the new elites?
It's a good question. And the way I would put that is, think about the mission of a political party. The mission of a political party is to get power and keep it. And for the parties, that means congregating towards the centrists, where most voters are. And so those superdelegates, these are not the extremists. These are people who have run in elections and have won. Take the example of Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell is opposed to Donald Trump as a candidate, not because he disagrees with Donald Trump alone in his policies, but because he thinks Donald Trump is a loser at the election box. And this is an election today, that the Republicans probably should win, and probably would win if it wasn't for Donald Trump. And so Mitch McConnell was arguing a year ago, we need to find a way to challenge Donald Trump and get a different candidate. That is a strategy and a mentality that is about winning elections. And take a look at the United Kingdom. This is the same dynamic. It's why the Labour conservative parties were excluding the candidates of the left and the right, because they wanted candidates who would help them win over the center. And by the center, I don't mean only moderate voters. It's kind of, you look at the distribution of preferences for policies, and it's where most people congregate, which tend to be in the middle. This is the case on abortion and a whole host of other issues. You find, the kind of everyday people finding a spot towards the middle, and the parties quite rationally would say, that's what we need to be. So I'm not worried about the superdelegates being ideologues themselves. If there's a risk, it's far, far more that the crowd we have today who are just committed to an extremism and a demagoguery that will be our end. This is not joking business. We are going to be in a really tough spot, I think, in a couple weeks.
We've seen here at the table a number of questions with regard to ranked choice voting. What do you think of ranked choice voting? You mentioned that you admired Alaska's system. It challenges a party extremist and moves candidates to the middle. And I know, having read the book, how you feel about it, but let's put that out there for the rest of the audience here.
So I done some research on ranked choice voting with my colleague, Joan Miller, and then with a graduate student. And the concern that we have in our research, which is statistical, along with that of a number of other academics, is that ranked choice voting is not delivering what's being promised. It's not bringing in new people. It's not bringing in more moderates. It's not leading to, greater independence. I know those are the promises, but the actual evidence doesn't support that. Instead, what we're getting is it's tending to reward, frankly, people like us who can identify what our policy preferences are, identify the candidates and where they stand on our policy preferences, and then rank the candidates. And so if you're given the opportunity to rank 3 candidates based on what you value, most of us can do that. But what we find is that voters who are less well-educated, voters with lower income, and voters of color have not been doing that. And so we're creating another form of inequality in our political system. And I know that may sound, some of you may be, I don't know if I agree with that. But let me tell you, one of the biggest, most enduring findings in political science for 70 years, and believe me, it's not a long list that lasts 70 years with everybody doing their research. But one of them is something called the social economic status gradient. And it just shows you that in terms of participation, interest, that it's higher with those who are white, higher income and higher education, and lower as you go down that gradient. And I'm afraid that ranked choice voting may be contributing to that, and it's one of the reasons that and I think, there's a group of folks who've been doing research on this are raising our hands and saying, let's be careful here. We don't want to go down a reform road that may add to our problems.
We have a heck of a smart audience here. We're getting some good questions. How would we filter out religious extremism from our primaries?
Well, no, I think that's a good question, and I think we need to pay more attention to the role of religion in our public life. And, I think it's the same thing. I mean, I put a lot of faith in the superdelegates. These are not, I think of them as like peer review. It's going to be the Mitch McConnell types. It's going to be, if we had one in Minnesota, it'd be Roger Moe. It'd be Arnie Carlson. I mean, these are going to be people who've been around, who have really known what it means to win an election and how you do it. They're not people thinking about the extremes. They're not thinking about, how do I advance a religious vision of Christian nationalism, for instance, that would not resonate with most people. Why? Because it's going to lose an election, because it doesn't represent the mass of voters. This is the great check, is how do you win elections? You've got to come to the middle. It's what we see all over the democratic world. You fight for the middle voter, you lock down your base, and then you fight for the middle. And we've got it backwards in America. You've seen the parties, really working their extremes in order to get super turnout from them.
From one incurable optimist to another, what can teachers and parents do to give children hope for democracy and help them understand the democratic process? There's so much negative and fake information.
There was a huge mistake about 20 years ago, and we scaled back our civics. I think this is really something. There were a group of us geeks who got together a couple decades ago, and we described it as like learning to brush your teeth. There's some things that just ought to be part of your nature. Voting should be part of it. Volunteering should be part of it. Understanding what separation of powers means. So I think that's very important. That's number one. We've got to bring civics back in a robust way. And I have heard teachers, we've held programs on this, who get worried we're going to get pulled into politics. That's a legitimate concern for a teacher who may have, some really angry parents. But there are things that can be done to help them. The second thing is I think we ought to get students involved. I mentioned our election administration program. We encourage students to volunteer in the process, not as partisans, but in helping to get people to the polls. In some areas, students can work as election judges or help with the process on election day. It's important to get the young folks involved and see that the system works. And I would say, for the understandable dread that we had about 2020, the system held. Okay, I'm not going to say it was an awesome performance, but the system held. And what I mean by that is the courts ruled, and in every case they ruled in a way that was appropriate. And I'm particularly proud of the election officials. With just really a handful of exceptions out of thousands of election officials, the election system worked in a nonpartisan, professional manner. How do we know that? Because there were hand recounts. In Georgia, it happened a couple times. And out of millions of votes, they were off by, a tiny, tiny fraction. And then it was reviewed by the courts. So I have a lot of faith that we have resilience, but, it's like a garden that is resilient, comes year after year. It doesn't happen by accident. You got to pay attention to it. If it's a drought, you got to get your hose out there to make sure you're watering your favorite shrubs, or they won't be here next year.
You talked about needing to have organizations that promoted social cohesion. This can't be the military, can it? The military is not a democracy. Are you thinking of something like the AmeriCorps?
AmeriCorps is a great example of it. In France, it was interesting. President Macron, has had very difficult time with the ethnic fracturing, the hatred towards Muslims, the rioting, the attacks, and so he's proposed in the last few years this citizens force in which they're encouraging teenagers to get involved in community activities. It's not required, but they're doing a lot to encourage the younger folks to get involved. And his explicit message is we need to get our young people meeting with and working with people outside their communities. I've been very impressed. I've spent some time traveling around Minnesota, particularly as the new Americans have settled in. Somalis and others, whether it's in the southwest corner of the state or elsewhere. And it's just remarkable how quickly people come together because their kids are playing soccer together, or they are working in 4-H, or they're working in some other activities. So every chance we get to build those bonds, we've got to do it. I have a lot of respect for the military, and I work with them to some extent, but that's not the vision I have.
Are Americans brainwashed? Russia, China, and Iran have spent billions of dollars worldwide to undermine democracy. Trump, with little Republican leadership opposition, has spread countless election lies, misinformation, and unfounded conspiracy theories. Are Americans brainwashed? How might pro-democracy institutions and individuals respond?
Yeah, it's a big problem. It's interesting, U.S. Homeland Security now lists disinformation, malinformation, and distortions as a national security threat. So, this is a real problem. There's no kind of jumping over that, and it's being funded abroad. AI makes it much more difficult. This British election I've been talking about, there were horrific AI-generated videos concocting stories about fraud by the conservative prime minister, totally untrue. You may remember the telephone calls that went out with someone sounding like Joe Biden telling people not to vote in New Hampshire. One of the horrible parts of this is it's hard to detect, right? The AI is so good, it doesn't really pop out at you. You have to have a trained eye. The Washington Post is a whole team devoted really for the next 2 weeks to single out what they see as distortion. So I think this is it's a real problem. It is a national security threat. It requires diligence. It requires a willingness on our part to double check. I got a call from a member of the media yesterday about a back of a van being opened with ballots being exposed. My first question is, have you validated that? Is this something that we've gotten off the internet, or is it validated? And the reporter said, I'm sending you a picture of it, and here's a statement from the Secretary of State. It's like, okay, let's talk about this. This is an illegal, inexcusable violation of Minnesota law. But we all need to have that kind of vigor and skepticism.
Kind of building on that, what guardrails might be put in place on the internet, and how can we strengthen civic engagement in a technological age?
That's a really hard question, and I've done.
We got good people.
I know. No, you guys are tough. And I've done 2 programs on this because you're up against 2 things. One is we believe in the free press. We believe in free speech. The First Amendment matters to all of us. And we have the freedom through the internet to go where we want. That's awesome. But then you've got people who are abusing it. So we need to create counter sources of information and the responsibility that we all have. We have a civic responsibility to double check information before you pass it along. The problem in Britain was in part that people just passed along this AI lie without double checking it. There is a lot of interest in the media in taking on this role of a kind of distortion monitor, and we have some. You're going to see it's going to pop right up. It'll become like the front page story. Washington Post put in a ton of money, and I'm sure they're looking to recoup that money. And that's good. You want to have, kind of the fact-checking extending.
Okay, I have to follow up with a softball of a question, hopefully. Is America ready for a woman president?
I've generally been impressed by this campaign and by the performance of Kamala Harris. I thought that debate, it was supposed to be an interview at Fox TV, but it really turned into a debate between Kamala Harris and the Fox television broadcaster. And I thought she handled that perfectly in a lot of ways, and she was able to score some criticisms of Donald Trump that were exactly what the Trump campaign doesn't want. The Trump campaign is concerned that Liz Cheney and Fox are going to be able to reach Republican voters and plant doubt. The idea is not that Republican voters are going to vote for Kamala Harris. The concern is they won't vote. And this is like the dirty secret of campaigning, but you can try to get voters, and then you can work on having them stay home. And I thought some of those answers that Kamala Harris gave to a large Republican audience were the kinds of things that might lead Republicans to say, I'm not going to vote for Kamala Harris, but I'm not sure I can vote for the other guy.
Can you speak to or comment on the 19% of uncommitted voters for the president in the DFL recent primary? Is that sort of a message important regarding policy?
We are at a tipping point in America. And one of my favorite factoids, I've been talking about this for decades now, but it's true at this moment. If you go back to 1980 election, Ronald Reagan won with 55% of the white vote, and it was a landslide. Well, a decisive win. And there was almost 90% of the electorate that was white. If you shoot ahead to 2008, John McCain had about 55% of the white vote, and he lost. How'd that happen? Well, the proportion of the white vote had declined to around 70% or so. Today, it's about 67%. Maybe it'll be under that when we count the ballots after November. My point is that the theory that the diversity in America was going to matter for elections is no longer a theory. It's in practice. And I think that's really reconstituting how we think about elections. I think I'm not hearing a whole lot of, kind of pushback on Kamala Harris based on her race. Maybe it's gender, but I'm not seeing as much of that. I think the challenge for Kamala Harris is simply that there are going to be a number of voters who are not happy with the direction of the country. And it's real. Inflation is a real effect. The trend has been down in terms of the rate, but the impact in terms of the boost in the cost of living for working people has been really hard. So a dozen eggs went from $2 or so up to $4 or $5. That's a huge hit, and that basic pattern that goes across milk and beef and so forth. I think that's the challenge, and so you can think of the electorate as probably 80-some% partisans. They're going to vote no matter what for their party's candidate. Then you got another maybe 10 or 15% who are going to be up for grabs. And those people not that well informed about a lot of policies. What's the 2025 project? Well, probably everyone here could write me a book report on it. But for that group of up for grab voters, not so much knowledge about it. Probably a lot of them have not heard of it. They're just not that interested in politics. There's more to life, but they're also, they're just not tied in. So for those people, they tend to draw conclusions about how they're going to vote based on a judgment about how things have been. And while things have improved on a number of fronts, on inflation, which is really hitting them hard, they're not feeling that great.
Is the precinct caucus system in Minnesota better, worse, or the same as the primary system?
Wow, I used to get in trouble with this question all the time with Don Frazier and Arvon Frazier, those of you who knew them, because they were big believers in the caucus system. You know, I don't think the caucus system works anymore. The truth, I mean, people are busy and they just stop by, or those of you who've shown up for caucuses on, you know, competitive elections, you can't even get into the rooms anymore because they're so crowded. So I'm not sure there's a role for the caucus system. I don't say that gleefully, because the dynamic of meeting with your neighbors to talk about policy and the candidates, you know, it's invigorating because sometimes you get people really in your face, but it's a wonderful experience. It's really kind of what democracy should be about. But I just don't know if it's feasible at this point.
We have 1 more minute left, and I'm going to condense my last question. It's prerogative of the moderator. To the reference you made earlier, and certainly in the book, with regard to the solution to return the power to the party. And we know in Chicago and other areas the machine that takes over. How do we safeguard against that system of machine returning back? And is that really plausible in the southern states where blacks, indigenous, people of color, their growth is seen as a threat and party officials are engaged in systemic and unlawful, I'll just say, shenanigans to disenfranchise marginalized groups?
There's no way you can look at the history of political parties in this country and feel happy about it. They are a flawed institution. They need to be constantly challenged and opposed. But I would remind you that, you know, looking at the Democratic Party in 1971 as McGovern and others are about to demolish the party structure, that it was that party that had delivered the progressive goals that McGovern had talked about. It was the party that had passed Medicare reform. It had passed a slew of significant civil rights legislation, voting rights legislation. And it's true that these policies were not implemented in a consistent way. It's taken years. The battle over fair housing continues. But that was the party. And why did that happen? Because there were a tremendous amount of pressure coming up through the community of support for the Democratic Party that pushed it to be living what it preached. And as you move into the 1970s, Barbara Mikulski and others continued that pattern of really changing the Democratic Party. So I don't think parties are kind of like a lost cause where they're just so corrupt, which is the vision that you hear from Robert La Follette and from George McGovern. These are just corrupt, hopeless institutions. No, they're bodies that need to be challenged and worked on, but they are a tool. They are a tool for mobilizing masses of people and for checking candidates who are in the extreme. And to me, our challenge today is how will we stop the extremists? Because if we don't, what's going to happen, I think, on Tuesday will be just part of the beginning.
Everyone, please help me in thanking Professor Larry Jacobs for joining us today at the Westminster Town Hall Forum. We invite those of you here in person to join us in Westminster Hall for breads and spreads. Just outside the sanctuary, you can also purchase a copy of Professor Jacobs' book. There's also a table where you can have your copy autographed. Thank you all, and please join us again on November 14th at the Westminster Town Hall Forum when we will host Makina Kelly for another insightful and thought-provoking evening. Buenas noches. Thank you for coming.